Welcome to Midnight and Murder, a crime storytelling series for sleeping, where crime meets calm and mystery meets the mind at rest. Tonight we focus on two longer historical crime stories. Let's go. Story 1, The Poison Chalice, the Dark Dynasty of the Borgias. In the shadow of St. Peter's Basilica, where the faithful gathered to seek salvation, a family of Spanish origin was weaving a web of corruption, murder, and treachery that would poison the very heart of Christendom. The year was 1492, and Rodrigo Borgia had just ascended to the papal throne as Alexander VI, bringing with him a legacy of ambition that would transform the Renaissance papacy into one of history's most notorious criminal enterprises. The Borgia name would become synonymous with every sin condemned by the church they nominally served: murder, incest, simony, and political manipulation on a scale that defied imagination. Yet their crimes were not the crude brutalities of common criminals, but sophisticated operations that blended poison with politics, seduction with assassination, and religious authority with temporal power. From the marble halls of the Vatican to the blood-soaked battlefields of the Papal States, the Borgias would leave a trail of victims that included cardinals and commoners, allies and enemies, family members and lovers. Their weapons were not swords and daggers alone, but subtle poisons that killed without leaving traces, political alliances that shifted like quicksand, and a ruthless pragmatism that recognized no moral boundaries. This is the story of a dynasty that reached the pinnacle of earthly power while plunging to the depths of human depravity, of a family that used the resources of the church to fund their crimes and the authority of the papacy to escape earthly justice. It is a tale of Renaissance Italy at its most brilliant and most corrupt, where art and murder flourished side by side, and where the line between salvation and damnation was measured not in spiritual terms, but in gold and blood. The Borgias understood that in the complex world of Renaissance politics, reputation was everything, and survival required the elimination of enemies before they could strike. They perfected the art of the political murder, transforming assassination from a crude tool of revenge into a refined instrument of statecraft. Their legacy would outlive them by centuries, serving as a cautionary tale about the corrupting influence of absolute power and the depths to which human ambition could sink. The man who would become Pope Alexander VI was born Rodrigo de Borja in 1431 in the Spanish town of Zativa in the Kingdom of Valencia. His family belonged to the minor nobility, but their modest circumstances would soon be transformed by the ambitions of his uncle, Alfonso de Borja, who would become Pope Calixtus III in 1455. This papal elevation would set the stage for one of the most notorious dynasties in church history. Young Rodrigo displayed from an early age the combination of intelligence, charisma, and ruthless ambition that would characterize his entire career. He was sent to study law at the University of Bologna, where he distinguished himself not only academically, but also in the subtle arts of networking and political manipulation. His fellow students would later recall a young man who seemed to possess an almost supernatural ability to identify and exploit the weaknesses of others. The election of his uncle as Pope Calixtus III in 1455 transformed Rodrigo's prospects overnight. The new pope immediately began elevating his Spanish relatives to positions of power within the church hierarchy, a practice known as nepotism that would reach unprecedented heights under later Borgia leadership. Rodrigo, despite being only 25 years old, was appointed Cardinal Deacon of San Nicola in Carceri, beginning a career that would span 4 decades and culminate in his own papal election. Cardinal Rodrigo Borgia quickly established himself as one of the most formidable political operators in Renaissance Rome. Unlike many of his contemporaries who viewed their ecclesiastical positions as sinecures, Rodrigo approached his role with the systematic efficiency of a military commander. He built networks of allies and informants throughout Italy and Europe, accumulated wealth through both legitimate and questionable means, and developed a reputation for being able to deliver results where others failed. His methods were often morally questionable, but undeniably effective. Rodrigo understood that in the corrupt world of Renaissance politics, success required the ability to operate in shades of gray rather than the black and white morality preached from church pulpits. He formed alliances with merchants, condottieri, and rival noble families, always ensuring that he held some advantage that could be exploited when necessary. The cardinal's personal life during this period was scandalous, even by the relaxed standards of Renaissance clergy. He openly maintained relationships with several mistresses, fathering numerous children who would later play crucial roles in his political schemes. His most significant relationship was with Vannozza dei Catani, a Roman noblewoman who bore him four children, Juan, Cesare, Lucrezia, and Joffre. These offspring would become central figures in the Borgia family's later criminal enterprises. Rodrigo's approach to fatherhood was characteristically calculating. Rather than hiding his illegitimate children as was customary for clerics, he openly acknowledged them and began grooming them for roles in his growing political empire. Young Cesare in particular showed early signs of possessing his father's ruthless intelligence, while Lucrezia demonstrated a political acumen that would make her one of the most powerful women of her generation. The cardinal's accumulation of wealth during these years was systematic and impressive. He held numerous lucrative church benefices, engaged in profitable business ventures, and was not above accepting bribes for favorable decisions in ecclesiastical matters. This wealth was not merely accumulated for personal luxury, though Rodrigo certainly enjoyed the finer things in life, but was viewed as a tool for gaining and maintaining political power. By the 1480s, Cardinal Borgia had become one of the most influential figures in the College of Cardinals. His ability to broker deals between competing factions made him indispensable to multiple popes, while his growing wealth allowed him to maintain a lifestyle that rivaled that of secular princes. His palace in Rome became a center of Renaissance culture and political intrigue, attracting artists, scholars, and political operators from across Europe. However, it was Rodrigo's mastery of the dark arts of Renaissance politics that truly set him apart from his contemporaries. He developed an extensive network of spies and informants who kept him informed of his rivals' activities and weaknesses. He was rumored to maintain detailed files on every significant political figure in Italy, cataloging their vices, debts, and secret shames for potential future use. The cardinal also began experimenting during this period with more direct methods of eliminating political obstacles. While concrete evidence is limited due to the secretive nature of such activities, contemporary sources suggest that several of Rodrigo's rivals died under suspicious circumstances during the 1480s. These deaths followed a pattern that would become the Borgia trademark: sudden illness after dining, mysterious accidents, and violent crimes that appeared to be random but served Rodrigo's political interests. The papal election of 1492 would provide Rodrigo with his greatest opportunity and greatest test. Pope Innocent IX had died in July of that year, leaving the papacy vacant at a time of tremendous political turmoil in Italy. The French were threatening to invade, the various Italian city-states were forming and breaking alliances with bewildering speed, and the Ottoman Empire continued to pose a threat to Christian Europe. The conclave that would elect the new pope was one of the most corrupt in church history. Cardinal Borgia entered the election as one of several leading candidates, but his systematic approach to vote buying and political manipulation would prove decisive. He had spent years building relationships with his fellow cardinals, accumulating detailed knowledge of their weaknesses and desires. The election process itself was a masterclass in Renaissance corruption. Rodrigo distributed vast sums of money, promised lucrative positions to supporters, and allegedly even resorted to threats against those who opposed him. The most famous example of his vote buying involved Cardinal Ascanio Sforza, who received 4 mule loads of silver in exchange for his support. On August 11, 1492, Rodrigo Borgia was elected Pope Alexander VI in what was widely recognized as the most corrupt papal election in memory. His victory was the culmination of decades of careful planning and systematic manipulation, but it also marked the beginning of a papacy that would scandalize Christendom and establish new standards for institutional corruption. The new pope's first acts in office demonstrated that his elevation had only intensified his ambitions rather than tempering them. He immediately began placing family members in positions of power, appointed his son Cesare as Archbishop of Valencia at age 18, and initiated a series of political maneuvers designed to expand Borgia power throughout Italy. Alexander VI understood that the papacy provided him with unique opportunities for both legitimate and illegitimate activities. The Church's vast resources could fund his political schemes. Its international reach could facilitate his diplomatic initiatives, and its moral authority could provide cover for activities that would be condemned if undertaken by secular rulers. The transformation from Cardinal Rodrigo Borgia to Pope Alexander VI marked not just a change in title, but an evolution in criminal sophistication. The skills and networks he had developed over 4 decades would now be deployed on a scale previously unimaginable, turning the Vatican itself into the headquarters of one of history's most successful criminal organizations. Pope Alexander VI's ascension to the papal throne in 1492 marked the beginning of what can only be described as the systematic transformation of the Catholic Church's highest office into a criminal enterprise of unprecedented scope and sophistication. Under his leadership, the Vatican became not merely corrupt, but actively criminal, with assassination, extortion, and fraud becoming routine tools of papal governance. The new pope's first priority was establishing a power base that could support his family's ambitions while generating the vast sums of money necessary to fund their increasingly elaborate schemes. Alexander VI approached this challenge with the systematic efficiency that had characterized his earlier career. But now he had access to resources that dwarfed anything available to even the wealthiest cardinal. The sale of church offices, known as simony, became the cornerstone of the Borgia financial empire. Alexander VI did not merely continue the corrupt practices of his predecessors, he industrialized them. Every significant position in the church hierarchy was explicitly priced, with the cost calibrated according to the office's potential for generating future income. Cardinals paid enormous sums for their red hats. Bishops bankrupted themselves to secure their sees, and even minor clerical positions were sold to the highest bidders. This systematic commercialization of the church extended beyond simple office selling to encompass every aspect of ecclesiastical authority. Dispensations from canonical law were routinely sold, allowing wealthy clients to circumvent religious restrictions on marriage, business practices, and moral conduct. Indulgences, which were supposed to provide spiritual benefits to the faithful, became a major source of revenue as the Pope's agents sold forgiveness for sins both past and future. The papal treasury swelled under these practices, but the money was not used for traditional church purposes such as charity, education, or the maintenance of religious buildings. Instead, it funded an increasingly complex network of political operations designed to advance Borgia family interests throughout Italy and Europe. Alexander VI's approach to papal diplomacy was revolutionary in its cynicism and effectiveness. Rather than serving as a neutral mediator between Christian nations, as had been traditional for popes, he actively played different factions against each other to maximize Borgia advantage. He made and broke alliances with bewildering speed, always ensuring that the Vatican emerged from each political realignment in a stronger position. The Pope's diplomatic methods often involved the use of his children as political instruments. His daughter Lucrezia was married multiple times to cement different alliances, with each marriage carefully calculated to advance Borgia interests. When political circumstances changed and a particular marriage became inconvenient, Alexander VI would arrange for its annulment or, in at least one case, the mysterious death of the unwanted son-in-law. The most notorious aspect of the Borgia criminal enterprise was their systematic use of assassination as a tool of governance. Under Alexander VI's leadership, the Vatican developed what amounted to a professional murder operation, complete with specialized personnel, sophisticated methods, and careful record-keeping. The Pope's personal involvement in these activities went far beyond mere authorization. He actively participated in planning murders and supervised their execution. The Borgia assassination methods were characterized by their sophistication and variety. Poison was the preferred weapon, partly because it was difficult to detect with medieval forensic techniques, and partly because it allowed for the appearance of natural death. The family developed relationships with skilled poisoners, including the notorious Venetian woman known as La Tofana, who specialized in creating undetectable toxins. The most famous of the Borgia poisons was cantarella, a substance that allegedly could be administered in wine or food and would cause death within hours or days, depending on the dosage. The symptoms resembled those of common illnesses, making it nearly impossible for victims or their families to prove murder. Contemporary sources suggest that cantarella was used in dozens of high-profile deaths during Alexander VI's papacy. However, poison was not the only weapon in the Borgia arsenal. They also employed hired assassins, arranged accidents, and orchestrated murders that appeared to be the result of common criminal activity. The family's network of agents throughout Italy ensured that they could arrange killings in almost any location while maintaining plausible deniability. The selection of assassination targets followed clear strategic logic. Wealthy cardinals who had accumulated significant fortunes were particular favorites, as their deaths allowed the Pope to seize their assets while eliminating potential political rivals. The pattern became so predictable that contemporaries began referring to certain cardinals as being marked for the cantarella when they fell out of papal favor. One of the most notorious examples of Borgia assassination methods involved Cardinal Giovanni Mitchell, the Venetian cardinal who had opposed Alexander VI's election and continued to criticize his conduct in office. In 1503, Mitchell suddenly fell ill after dining at the Vatican and died within days despite the attention of the best physicians in Rome. His vast fortune was immediately seized by the papal treasury, and his opposition to Borgia policies died with him. The systematic nature of these crimes was enhanced by careful documentation and record-keeping. The Borgias maintained detailed accounts of their criminal activities, treating murder and extortion as business expenses to be tracked and analyzed. These records, some of which survived in the Vatican archives, provide unprecedented insight into the operations of a Renaissance criminal organization. The papal court under Alexander VI became a magnet for ambitious individuals who were willing to participate in or overlook criminal activities in exchange for wealth and advancement. The Pope surrounded himself with men who shared his lack of moral constraints, creating an institutional culture where crime was not merely tolerated but actively encouraged. Among the most notorious of these associates was Michelotto Corella, a Spanish soldier who served as the family's chief assassin. Corella was responsible for numerous murders throughout Italy, operating with papal protection and funding. His methods were varied and creative, ranging from straightforward stabbings to elaborate poisoning schemes that could eliminate multiple targets simultaneously. The Borgia criminal enterprise also extended to more traditional forms of organized crime, including extortion, fraud, and theft. The Pope used his ecclesiastical authority to legitimize seizures of property belonging to his enemies, while his agents engaged in more conventional criminal activities throughout the papal states. The scale of corruption under Alexander VI was so extensive that it fundamentally altered the nature of the papacy itself. Rather than serving as the spiritual leader of Christendom, the Pope became the head of a criminal organization that happened to control significant religious authority. This transformation had profound implications, not only for the immediate victims of Borgia crimes, but for the entire structure of medieval Christianity. The financial resources generated by these criminal activities allowed the Borgias to operate on a scale that dwarfed other Renaissance criminal organizations. They could afford to maintain large networks of agents and assassins, fund military campaigns, and engage in political manipulations that required enormous capital investments. Perhaps most significantly, the Borgias' control of papal authority provided them with a form of immunity from earthly justice that other criminals could never achieve. Who could arrest the Pope? What court could try the Vicar of Christ? This unique position allowed them to operate with unprecedented boldness and scope. The systematic criminalization of the papacy under Alexander VI represents one of the most successful examples of institutional capture in history. A religious organization dedicated to moral leadership was transformed into a criminal enterprise that retained its moral authority while using it to facilitate increasingly elaborate crimes. This transformation would have far-reaching consequences that extended well beyond the immediate Borgia family. The scandals of Alexander VI's papacy would contribute to the growing calls for church reform that would eventually culminate in the Protestant Reformation, fundamentally altering the religious landscape of Europe. If Pope Alexander VI was the architect of the Borgia criminal empire, his son Cesare was its most ruthless and effective enforcer. Born around 1475, Cesare Borgia would become one of history's most notorious figures. A man who combined the education of a Renaissance prince with the instincts of a professional killer. His transformation from cardinal to condottiero to political mastermind represents one of the most dramatic character evolutions in the annals of crime. Cesare's early life was carefully orchestrated by his father to prepare him for greatness, though the specific nature of that greatness remained undefined during his youth. He received the finest education available in Renaissance Europe, studying at the universities of Perugia and Pisa, where he mastered Latin, Greek, law, and theology. However, his true education came from observing his father's political machinations and gradually participating in the family's criminal enterprises. At the age of 18, Cesare was appointed Archbishop of Valencia by his father, making him one of the youngest men ever to hold such a high ecclesiastical position. This appointment was pure nepotism, but it served important strategic purposes for the Borgia family. It provided Cesare with significant income and political influence while positioning him within the church hierarchy where he could serve his father's interests. The young archbishop's conduct in office scandalized even the corrupt standards of Renaissance clergy. He openly maintained mistresses, engaged in violent disputes with rival nobles, and showed complete indifference to his spiritual duties. Contemporary accounts describe him as handsome, charismatic, and utterly immoral, possessing a charm that could seduce enemies and a ruthlessness that could destroy them without hesitation. Cesare's first documented involvement in murder occurred in 1497, though he had likely been participating in family criminal activities for several years prior. The victim was his own brother, Juan Borgia, Duke of Gandia, whose body was found floating in the Tiber River with multiple stab wounds. The murder shocked Rome and provided the first clear indication of the depths of Borgia family depravity. The motive for Juan's murder was complex, involving both personal and political considerations. Juan had been their father's favorite son and was being groomed for temporal leadership of the Borgia territories, a role that Cesare coveted for himself. Additionally, there were rumors of an incestuous relationship between Juan and their sister Lucrezia, which may have inflamed Cesare's jealousy and rage. The assassination was carefully planned and executed with professional precision. Juan was lured to a meeting under false pretenses, murdered by hired assassins, and his body disposed of in a manner designed to send a clear message to other potential rivals. The murder demonstrated Cesare's willingness to kill even family members when they stood in the way of his ambitions. Pope Alexander VI was devastated by Juan's death, but he also recognized that Cesare had emerged as the most capable of his sons. Rather than seeking justice for Juan's murder, the Pope tacitly accepted the new reality and began grooming Cesare for the temporal leadership that had been intended for his brother. This decision would prove to have far-reaching consequences for both the Borgia family and Renaissance Italy. In 1498, Cesare took the unprecedented step of resigning from the cardinalate to pursue a secular career. This decision was revolutionary, as no cardinal had ever voluntarily abandoned such a high ecclesiastical position. The resignation freed Cesare from the canonical restrictions that limited his activities as a cleric and allowed him to openly pursue military and political objectives. The newly secular Cesare was immediately appointed as a papal legate to France, where he negotiated a series of agreements that would provide military support for Borgia expansion in Italy. His diplomatic skills proved as formidable as his capacity for violence, and he returned to Rome with French backing for a campaign to conquer the Romagna region of central Italy. The conquest of Romagna was Cesare's masterpiece of political and military strategy, but it was also a catalog of atrocities that demonstrated his complete lack of moral constraints. City after city fell to his forces through a combination of military pressure, political manipulation, and systematic terror. Those who resisted were subjected to exemplary punishments designed to discourage further opposition. Cesare's methods during the Romagna campaign became legendary for their cruelty and effectiveness. He perfected the art of psychological warfare, using carefully orchestrated displays of violence to intimidate enemies and allies alike. The massacre at Senigallia in 1502, where he eliminated several rival condottieri who had been lured to a peace conference, became a textbook example of Renaissance treachery. The Senigallia operation demonstrated Cesare's evolution into a criminal mastermind of the highest order. He invited his enemies to a reconciliation meeting, provided them with safe conduct guarantees, and then systematically murdered them once they were in his power. The victims included Vitellozzo Vitelli, Oliverotto da Fermo, and the Duke of Gravina, all experienced military commanders who should have known better than to trust Borgia promises. The psychological impact of Senigallia was enormous, establishing Cesare's reputation as a man whose word was worthless, but whose capacity for revenge was limitless. Future opponents would think twice before challenging him, knowing that surrender might be as dangerous as resistance. This reputation became one of Cesare's most valuable weapons, often allowing him to achieve his objectives through intimidation rather than actual violence. Cesare's personal involvement in torture and murder went beyond mere oversight. He actively participated in the killing and appeared to derive pleasure from his victims' suffering. Contemporary accounts describe him personally strangling enemies, supervising torture sessions, and devising increasingly creative methods of execution. His capacity for cruelty seemed to increase with his power, suggesting a personality that was fundamentally sadistic. The administrative side of Cesare's criminal operations was as sophisticated as their violent aspects. He maintained detailed intelligence networks throughout Italy, employed professional assassins and torturers, and developed systematic methods for extracting wealth from conquered territories. His court became a center for ambitious criminals and displaced nobles seeking opportunities to profit from his expanding power. Among Cesare's most trusted associates was Michelotto Corella, the Spanish assassin who served as his chief enforcer. Corella was responsible for numerous murders throughout Italy, operating with Cesare's protection and according to his detailed instructions. The relationship between the two men was based on mutual understanding of their criminal objectives and shared contempt for conventional moral restraints. Cesare's treatment of women was particularly notorious, even by the standards of his time. He was accused of multiple rapes and was rumored to maintain a harem of kidnapped noblewomen in his various castles. His sexual appetites were apparently as excessive and cruel as his political ambitions, and he used sexual violence as another tool of intimidation and control. The peak of Cesare's power came in 1503, when he controlled most of central Italy and seemed poised to become one of the peninsula's dominant figures. His military successes had been matched by political achievements, including alliances with major European powers and recognition as a legitimate ruler by other Italian princes. He had effectively carved out an independent kingdom for himself while serving as his father's secular arm. However, Cesare's entire position depended on his father's continued occupancy of the papal throne. Pope Alexander VI's death in August 1503 would expose the fundamental weakness of the Borgia criminal enterprise, its dependence on papal authority. Without his father's protection and resources, Cesare would find himself vulnerable to the many enemies he had made during his rise to power. The circumstances of Alexander VI's death remain mysterious and have been the subject of speculation for centuries. Some contemporary sources suggested that both the Pope and Cesare had been poisoned at a dinner party, with Cesare surviving only because he was younger and stronger. Other accounts claim that they had accidentally consumed wine intended for one of their enemies, falling victim to their own assassination plot. Whatever the truth about Alexander VI's death, its immediate impact on Cesare was devastating. The new pope, Pius III, was hostile to Borgia interests, and his successor, Julius II, was actively committed to destroying Cesare's power. Within months of his father's death, Cesare found himself stripped of his territories, abandoned by his allies, and hunted by his enemies. Cesare's final years were a dramatic reversal of his earlier fortunes. He was imprisoned, escaped, and eventually died in 1507 while fighting as a mercenary in Spain. His death at the age of 31 ended one of the most remarkable criminal careers in history, but his impact on Renaissance politics and culture would endure for centuries. The legacy of Cesare Borgia extends far beyond his immediate crimes and conquests. He became the inspiration for Niccolò Machiavelli's The Prince, serving as the model for the amoral ruler who achieves his objectives through any means necessary. His life demonstrated both the possibilities and the limitations of criminal leadership in Renaissance society. Cesare's transformation from cardinal to condottiero to criminal mastermind represents one of the most complete rejections of moral authority in recorded history. He used every advantage provided by his birth, education, and position to pursue power without regard for conventional ethical constraints, achieving remarkable success before ultimately falling victim to the same forces of violence and betrayal that he had so expertly deployed against others. Among the children of Pope Alexander VI, none has captured the historical imagination quite like Lucrezia Borgia. Born in 1480, she would become one of the most controversial figures of the Renaissance, a woman whose name became synonymous with poison, political intrigue, and sexual scandal. Yet the reality of Lucrezia's life was far more complex than the legend that has surrounded her, revealing a woman who was simultaneously victim and perpetrator, pawn and player in the deadly game of Borgia politics. Lucrezia's early life was shaped by her father's ambitions and her family's criminal activities in ways that would profoundly influence her character and capabilities. Unlike her brothers, who were groomed for clerical or military careers, Lucrezia's primary value to the family lay in her potential as a diplomatic tool through marriage alliances. However, she would prove to be far more than a passive participant in these arrangements, developing her own capacity for political manipulation and, according to many sources, participating directly in the family's criminal enterprises. Her education was exceptional for a woman of her era, encompassing not only traditional feminine accomplishments, but also Latin, classical literature, and the arts of political negotiation. More importantly, she received an informal but comprehensive education in the dark arts of Renaissance politics through daily exposure to her family's criminal activities. She learned to read the subtle signs of political danger, to identify potential enemies and allies, and to use charm and intelligence as weapons in the constant struggle for survival and advancement. Lucrezia's first marriage, arranged by her father in 1493, when she was just 13 years old, established the pattern that would characterize her entire life. Her husband was Giovanni Sforza, Lord of Pesaro, a minor noble whose primary value lay in his family connections to the powerful Sforza dynasty of Milan. The marriage was purely political, designed to strengthen Borgia alliances in northern Italy. However, political circumstances changed rapidly in Renaissance Italy, and alliances that seemed advantageous one year could become liabilities the next. By 1497, the Borgia family's strategic interests had shifted, making Giovanni Sforza more of an obstacle than an asset. The marriage had to be dissolved, but divorce was not an option for high-ranking Catholics. Instead, Pope Alexander VI declared the marriage null on the grounds that it had never been consummated. This annulment proceeding revealed the depths of Borgia cynicism and cruelty. Giovanni Sforza was forced to publicly declare his own impotence to secure the annulment, a humiliation that destroyed his reputation and political prospects. When he initially refused, he was threatened with assassination, and there were credible reports that Lucrezia herself participated in the intimidation campaign against her husband. The annulment also generated the first serious rumors about incestuous relationships within the Borgia family. Giovanni Sforza, seeking revenge for his humiliation, publicly claimed that the real reason for the annulment was that Pope Alexander VI wanted to maintain an incestuous relationship with his own daughter. These accusations, whether true or false, would follow Lucrezia for the rest of her life. Following the annulment, Lucrezia entered into a relationship with Pedro Calderón, a Spanish nobleman who served in her father's household. This affair produced a son, Giovanni Borgia, whose parentage would become another source of scandal and speculation. Some sources claim that the child's father was actually Pope Alexander VI, or Cesare Borgia, adding fuel to the persistent rumors about incest within the family. Pedro Calderón's fate illustrated the dangerous nature of intimate relationships with Borgia family members. He was murdered in 1498, allegedly on the orders of Cesare Borgia, who may have been motivated by jealousy over his sister's affections or by political considerations related to her upcoming second marriage. The murder was carried out with characteristic Borgia efficiency, and Calderón's body was found floating in the Tiber River. Lucrezia's second marriage was to Alfonso of Aragon, Duke of Bisegli, an illegitimate son of the King of Naples. This union was designed to strengthen Borgia alliances with the Kingdom of Naples, but like her first marriage, it would ultimately become a victim of changing political circumstances. Alfonso was reportedly genuinely in love with Lucrezia, and contemporary sources suggest that she may have reciprocated his feelings more than was typical in arranged marriages of the period. The marriage produced a son, Rodrigo of Aragon, but political events soon made Alfonso more of a liability than an asset to Borgia interests. The family's alliance with France created conflicts with their previous Neapolitan connections, and Alfonso's continued presence became inconvenient for their political strategies. In July 1500, Alfonso was attacked by unknown assailants while leaving St. Peter's Basilica, suffering severe injuries but surviving the initial assassination attempt. He was taken to the Vatican to recover, where he was reportedly nursed by Lucrezia herself. However, a month later, he was found dead in his chambers, allegedly strangled by Michelotto Corella on the orders of Cesare Borgia. Lucrezia's reaction to her husband's murder provided insights into her complex character and her deep involvement in family affairs. While she appeared to grieve genuinely for Alfonso's death, she made no attempt to seek justice or revenge against her brother. Instead, she quickly adapted to the new political reality and began preparing for her next marriage alliance. The third and final marriage of Lucrezia Borgia was to Alfonso d'Este, heir to the Duke of Ferrara, in 1502. This union represented the pinnacle of Borgia's social climbing, as the Este family was one of the most prestigious dynasties in Italy. However, the marriage negotiations revealed the extent to which Lucrezia's reputation had been damaged by her family's criminal activities and the scandals surrounding her previous marriages. The Este family initially rejected the proposed marriage, citing concerns about Lucrezia's moral character and the dangerous nature of alliance with the Borgias. It required enormous political pressure from Pope Alexander VI, including threats against Este territories and interests, to force them to accept the arrangement. Even then, the marriage contract included unusual provisions designed to protect the Este family from potential Borgia treachery. Despite these inauspicious beginnings, Lucrezia's marriage to Alfonso d'Este would prove to be relatively successful and stable. She adapted to life in Ferrara with remarkable skill, becoming an effective duchess and patron of the arts. However, her past continued to cast shadows over her new life, and she maintained connections to her family's criminal activities even after establishing herself in her new home. During her time in Ferrara, Lucrezia was accused of continuing to use poison as a political weapon, allegedly eliminating threats to her position and advancing her family's interests through selective assassinations. The most persistent rumors concerned a special ring she was said to wear, which contained a hollow chamber filled with deadly poison that could be administered to enemies during seemingly innocent social interactions. Whether or not the poison ring was real, Lucrezia certainly maintained the intelligence networks and political connections that would have made such activities possible. She corresponded regularly with her father and brother, providing them with information about northern Italian politics and receiving instructions for advancing Borgia interests in the region. The death of Pope Alexander VI in 1503 marked a turning point in Lucrezia's life, as it did for all members of the Borgia family. With her father dead and her brother Cesare's power rapidly declining, she found herself in an increasingly vulnerable position. However, her marriage to Alfonso d'Este provided her with protection and a degree of independence that allowed her to survive the collapse of Borgia power. Lucrezia's later years in Ferrara were marked by a gradual transformation from political operative to Renaissance patron. She supported artists and poets, engaged in charitable activities, and appeared to embrace a more conventional role as a noble wife and mother. However, this transformation may have been more apparent than real, as she continued to be involved in political intrigues and was suspected of several mysterious deaths that occurred among her enemies and rivals. The question of Lucrezia's true character and the extent of her criminal activities has fascinated historians for centuries. Some scholars argue that she was primarily a victim of her family's ambitions, forced into political marriages and criminal activities against her will. Others contend that she was an active and willing participant in Borgia crimes, using her intelligence and charm to advance her family's interests and eliminate their enemies. The truth likely lies somewhere between these extremes. Lucrezia was undoubtedly shaped by her family's criminal culture and participated in activities that would be considered horrific by modern standards. However, she also demonstrated remarkable adaptability and survival skills, successfully navigating the dangerous world of Renaissance politics while maintaining her position and protecting her interests. Her legacy extends beyond her immediate criminal activities to encompass her role as a patron of Renaissance culture and her influence on contemporary attitudes toward women in politics. She demonstrated that women could be effective political operators in their own right, though the methods she employed were often as ruthless as those used by her male contemporaries. Lucrezia Borgia died in 1519 at the age of 39, having survived all of her infamous family members and established herself as a respected, if controversial, figure in Italian society. Her life embodied the contradictions of the Renaissance, combining genuine cultural achievement with moral corruption, political sophistication with personal tragedy, and remarkable success with ultimate notoriety. The legend of Lucrezia Borgia has overshadowed the historical reality in many ways, but both the legend and the reality reveal important truths about the nature of power, ambition, and moral compromise in Renaissance society. She remains one of history's most fascinating and complex criminals, a woman who used every tool at her disposal, including charm, intelligence, and poison, to survive and thrive in one of the most dangerous political environments ever recorded. The Apostolic Palace, seat of papal power for over a millennium, became under the Borgias something unprecedented in the history of Christendom, the operational headquarters of a sophisticated criminal organization. Behind the sacred facades and holy rituals, a parallel world operated where murder was planned with the same careful attention to detail as papal ceremonies, and where the resources of the church were systematically diverted to fund assassination, extortion, and political manipulation on an unprecedented scale. The transformation of the Vatican into a criminal enterprise required careful organization and absolute secrecy. Pope Alexander VI established what amounted to a shadow bureaucracy within the papal administration, with trusted associates managing different aspects of the family's illegal activities. These operations were hidden within the legitimate functions of church government, making detection nearly impossible for outside observers. At the heart of this criminal apparatus was the papal treasury, which served as both bank and money laundering operation for Borgia activities. The church's traditional sources of income, tithes, donations, and fees for religious services, were supplemented by systematic extortion, the sale of forged documents, and profits from assassination contracts. The papal treasurer, a Spanish cleric named Juan Lopez, maintained two sets of books, one for legitimate church expenses and another for what were euphemistically termed special pontifical projects. The most sophisticated aspect of the Vatican's criminal operations was its intelligence network, which rivaled those of major European powers. Pope Alexander VI understood that information was as valuable as gold in Renaissance politics, and he invested enormous resources in gathering intelligence about allies and enemies alike. This network extended throughout Italy and into major European capitals, providing the Borgias with advance warning of threats and opportunities for profit. The intelligence operation was managed by Giovanni Vera, a former Spanish merchant who had demonstrated remarkable skills in information gathering and analysis. Under his direction, the Vatican maintained agents in every major Italian city, many European courts, and even within the households of other prominent church officials. These agents reported regularly on political developments, personal scandals, and financial opportunities that could be exploited by the Borgia family. The information gathered by this network was used for multiple criminal purposes. Blackmail became a routine tool of papal diplomacy, with compromising information about rival nobles and clergy used to secure favorable terms in negotiations or to eliminate opposition to Borgia policies. The Pope maintained detailed files on the sexual indiscretions, financial irregularities, and political betrayals of virtually every significant figure in Italian society. Perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the Vatican's criminal operations was the systematic use of assassination as a tool of governance. Pope Alexander VI established what amounted to a murder bureau within the papal administration, complete with specialized personnel, standardized procedures, and careful documentation. The operation was supervised by Cesare Borgia, but reported directly to the Pope himself. The Assassination Bureau maintained a roster of professional killers recruited from across Europe. These operatives included Spanish soldiers displaced by the end of the Reconquista, Italian condottieri seeking employment, and even some clergy who had abandoned their spiritual vocations for more lucrative criminal activities. Each assassin was carefully vetted and trained in the specific methods favored by the Borgia family. The Bureau's methods were diverse and sophisticated, adapted to the specific circumstances of each target, and designed to minimize the risk of detection. Poison remained the preferred weapon for high-profile targets, but the assassins were also skilled in staging accidents, arranging fatal duels, and orchestrating murders that appeared to be the work of common criminals or political rivals. The logistics of these operations were handled with military precision. Safe houses were maintained in major Italian cities to provide base of operations for traveling assassins. Weapons and poisons were cached in strategic locations throughout the peninsula. Escape routes were planned in advance, and false identities were prepared for operatives who might need to disappear quickly after completing their missions. The Vatican's criminal operations also included sophisticated financial crimes that generated enormous profits while appearing legitimate to casual observers. The sale of church offices was expanded into a complex system that resembled modern securities fraud, with positions sold multiple times to different buyers and papal documents forged to support fraudulent claims to ecclesiastical authority. One of the most profitable schemes involved the creation of false relics and their sale to wealthy collectors and religious institutions. The Borgias commissioned skilled artisans to create convincing forgeries of sacred objects, complete with fraudulent documentation attesting to their authenticity. These items were then sold at enormous markups to buyers throughout Europe who believed they were acquiring genuine articles of spiritual significance. The papal mint was also corrupted to serve Borgia interests, producing counterfeit coins that were mixed with legitimate currency and circulated throughout Italy. This operation was particularly sophisticated, involving the recruitment of master coiners and the acquisition of precious metals through theft and extortion. The counterfeit coins were virtually indistinguishable from genuine ones, allowing the scheme to continue undetected for years. Within the Apostolic Palace itself, specific locations were adapted to serve the needs of the criminal organization. Secret passages were constructed to allow discreet movement of personnel and materials. Hidden chambers were created to store weapons, poisons, and incriminating documents. The papal apartments were modified to include rooms where sensitive meetings could be held without risk of surveillance. The most notorious of these spaces was a chamber deep within the palace that served as both torture room and disposal facility. Here, enemies of the Borgia family were interrogated using methods that would have shocked professional torturers. The room was equipped with specialized implements, designed to extract information while minimizing the risk of accidental death, though many subjects ultimately perished from their injuries. Bodies of murder victims were often brought to this chamber for disposal through a sophisticated system that had been constructed within the palace's ancient foundations. Corpses could be dismembered and their remains dissolved in acid baths, leaving no physical evidence of the crimes. The dissolved remains were then flushed into the Roman sewer system, ensuring that they would never be discovered. The Borgia family's use of the Vatican as a criminal headquarters required the cooperation or intimidation of hundreds of church officials and servants. Many were willing participants, attracted by the wealth and power that came from association with papal authority. Others were coerced through threats or blackmail, forced to participate in activities that violated their religious convictions and moral principles. The atmosphere within the Vatican during the Borgia papacy was one of constant tension and fear. Servants and officials never knew who might be listening to their conversations or reporting their activities to papal authorities. Loyalty was constantly tested through assignments that required participants to compromise themselves morally, ensuring their continued cooperation through shared guilt. Religious ceremonies during this period took on a surreal quality, as sacred rituals were conducted by men who had just finished planning murders or counting the proceeds from extortion schemes. The contrast between the spiritual significance of papal functions and the criminal reality of papal governance created a cognitive dissonance that affected everyone within the Vatican hierarchy. The papal court became a magnet for the most corrupt and ambitious individuals in Renaissance society. Nobles, merchants, and clergy flocked to Rome, seeking opportunities to profit from association with papal power, often bringing their own criminal skills and connections to contribute to the Borgia enterprise. This concentration of criminal talent made the Vatican one of the most dangerous places in Europe for anyone who posed a threat to family interests. The security measures implemented to protect the criminal operations were extraordinary even by Renaissance standards. The Papal Guard was expanded and filled with Spanish soldiers whose loyalty was ensured through generous pay and participation in profitable criminal activities. The Vatican's traditional Italian guards were gradually replaced with foreigners who had no local connections that might compromise their reliability. Counterintelligence operations were implemented to identify and eliminate potential threats from within the papal administration. Suspected spies were subjected to elaborate tests designed to reveal their true loyalties, and those who failed these tests often disappeared without explanation. The atmosphere of paranoia and suspicion made effective opposition to Borgia activities nearly impossible. The documentation of these criminal activities was itself a masterpiece of organizational efficiency. Records were kept in code, with innocent-sounding terms used to describe illegal activities. Spiritual counseling might refer to torture sessions, while charitable donations could indicate payments to assassins. These coded records allowed the Borgias to maintain detailed accounts of their criminal empire, while providing plausible deniability if the documents were ever discovered. The Vatican's transformation into a criminal headquarters under the Borgias represents one of the most complete institutional corruptions in recorded history. The physical spaces, administrative structures, and human resources of the Catholic Church were systematically perverted to serve the interests of a single family's criminal ambitions. This transformation would have lasting consequences for the Church's credibility and would contribute to the religious upheavals that would reshape European Christianity in the following century. The legacy of the Borgia Vatican serves as a cautionary tale about the corrupting influence of absolute power and the ease with which even the most sacred institutions can be perverted when their leadership abandons moral constraints. The chambers and passages that once echoed with prayers and hymns became theaters for some of the most sophisticated criminal operations in European history, demonstrating that no institution, however hallowed, is immune to corruption when its guardians choose evil over good. Among the many criminal innovations of the Borgia family, none was more terrifying or effective than their mastery of poison as a weapon of political assassination. Under their patronage, the ancient art of toxicology evolved from crude folk remedies into a sophisticated science of death, with skilled practitioners developing compounds that could kill quickly or slowly, obviously or mysteriously, depending on the specific requirements of each political situation. The Borgias' relationship with poison began during Rodrigo's early years as a cardinal, when he first encountered the Venetian tradition of using subtle toxins to eliminate political rivals. Venice had long been a center of poisoning expertise, partly due to its extensive trade connections, which provided access to exotic substances from around the world, and partly due to the city's Republican government, which made traditional forms of political violence more difficult to employ. The Pope's first poison master was a mysterious figure known only as Maestro Giovanni, an elderly Italian who claimed to have learned his craft from Byzantine physicians fleeing the Ottoman conquest of Constantinople. Maestro Giovanni introduced the Borgias to the fundamental principles of toxicology, the importance of dosage, the significance of delivery methods, and the art of selecting poisons whose symptoms would mimic natural illnesses. Under Maestro Giovanni's tutelage, the Borgias learned that effective political poisoning required far more than simply administering deadly substances to enemies. The goal was not merely to kill, but to do so in a manner that avoided suspicion, prevented retaliation, and sometimes sent specific messages to other potential opponents. Each assassination had to be carefully planned to achieve maximum political benefit while minimizing risk to the perpetrators. The most famous of the Borgia poisons was the legendary cantarella, a substance that became synonymous with their family name throughout Renaissance Europe. Contemporary sources describe cantarella as a white powder that could be mixed with wine or food without detection, causing death within hours or days, depending on the amount administered. The poison allegedly produced symptoms that closely resembled those of common illnesses, making it nearly impossible for physicians to detect foul play. Modern toxicologists have debated the likely composition of cantarella, with most experts concluding that it was probably a preparation containing arsenic, though possibly enhanced with other substances to increase its effectiveness or alter its symptoms. Arsenic was readily available in Renaissance Italy, often disguised as cosmetics or medicinal preparations, and its effects could be tailored through careful dosage to produce either rapid death or a lingering illness that might last for weeks. The preparation of cantarella and other Borgia poisons was a closely guarded family secret, with the knowledge passed down through a select group of trusted practitioners. The process allegedly involved multiple steps of refinement and testing, with different formulations developed for different purposes. Some versions were designed to kill quickly and obviously, serving as warnings to other enemies, while others produced slow, wasting illnesses that allowed the victim time for final arrangements while ensuring their eventual death. The Borgias also developed a sophisticated understanding of delivery methods, recognizing that the effectiveness of poison depended as much on how it was administered as on its inherent toxicity. They experimented with various techniques for introducing toxins into food and drink, including special serving vessels with hidden compartments, poisoned rings that could contaminate wine when dipped into glasses, and treated objects that would transfer poison through skin contact. One of the most ingenious delivery methods attributed to the Borgias involved specially prepared books. The pages of these volumes were treated with contact poisons that would be absorbed through the skin when readers moistened their fingers to turn pages, as was customary at the time. The poison would accumulate gradually in the victim's system, producing symptoms that would appear days or weeks after the initial exposure, and making it nearly impossible to trace the source of the contamination. The family's poison operations were managed with the same attention to detail that characterized their other criminal activities. Detailed records were kept of which substances were used against which targets, along with observations about effectiveness and detectability. These records, written in code and hidden within the Vatican archives, provided a comprehensive database of toxicological knowledge that would have been invaluable to other poisoners. The Borgias maintained relationships with poison suppliers throughout Europe and the Mediterranean, ensuring access to rare substances that might be needed for specific operations. These suppliers included apothecaries, physicians, and merchants who had access to exotic materials through their legitimate businesses. The family's agents would purchase small quantities of various substances from multiple sources, ensuring that no single supplier could provide evidence of their criminal activities. Testing of new poisons and delivery methods was conducted systematically, often using prisoners condemned to death for other crimes. These unfortunate individuals became unwilling subjects in experiments designed to evaluate the effectiveness of different toxins and determine optimal dosages for various circumstances. The results of these experiments were carefully recorded and incorporated into the family's growing database of poisoning techniques. The psychological impact of the Borgias' reputation as master poisoners was as important as the actual effectiveness of their toxins. Throughout Renaissance Italy, the mere suggestion that someone had earned Borgia displeasure was often sufficient to secure their cooperation or withdrawal from threatening activities. The fear of poison created an atmosphere of paranoia that made normal political negotiations extremely difficult and gave the family significant advantages in diplomatic situations. This reputation was carefully cultivated through selective leaks of information about successful poisonings and occasional demonstrations of toxicological expertise. When Cardinal Giovanni Mitchell died suddenly after dining at the Vatican in 1503, his symptoms were so consistent with arsenic poisoning that even papal physicians whispered about the cause of death. Such incidents served as powerful deterrents to others who might consider opposing Borgia interests. The family's poison operations extended beyond simple assassination to include more subtle forms of chemical warfare. They developed substances that could induce temporary illness, allowing them to incapacitate enemies at crucial moments without necessarily killing them. Other compounds could cause permanent disability or disfigurement, serving as punishments for those who had betrayed or disappointed the family. The Borgias also pioneered the use of poison as a tool of extortion, threatening to contaminate water supplies or food stores unless their demands were met. These threats were made credible by occasional demonstrations, such as the mysterious illness that struck an entire monastery that had refused to support papal policies. The monks recovered after a few days, but the message was clear. Opposition to Borgia interests could have consequences that extended far beyond individual targets. The international dimensions of the Borgia poison operations were extensive, with agents operating throughout Europe to eliminate threats and advance family interests. The assassination of Prince Djam, brother of the Ottoman Sultan, in 1495 was widely attributed to Borgia poison, administered as part of a complex diplomatic arrangement with the Turkish court. This killing demonstrated the family's willingness to operate on the highest levels of international politics and their ability to carry out murders far from their Italian base. The training of new poison masters was a carefully controlled process, with candidates selected for their discretion, loyalty, and technical aptitude. Apprentices would spend years learning the properties of different substances, the symptoms they produced, and the methods for administering them effectively. Only the most trusted students would be taught the secrets of Cantarella and other signature Borgia compounds. The psychological profiles of successful Borgia poisoners reveal individuals who combine technical expertise with complete moral detachment. They were able to view their victims as subjects in scientific experiments rather than human beings, allowing them to perfect their craft without being inhibited by empathy or guilt. This emotional distance was considered essential for effective operation in the high-stakes world of political assassination. The decline of the Borgia poison operations began with the death of Pope Alexander VI in 1503, under circumstances that many contemporaries attributed to accidental poisoning. According to several accounts, both the Pope and Cesare Borgia became ill after consuming wine that had been intended for one of their enemies, suggesting that they had fallen victim to their own assassination plot. Whether or not this account is accurate, the symbolic significance was enormous. The masters of poison had apparently been destroyed by their own weapons. The incident served as a powerful reminder of the ultimate futility of criminal power and the poetic justice that could result when evil turned upon itself. The legacy of Borgia toxicological expertise extended far beyond their immediate criminal activities. Their innovations in poison preparation and delivery influenced criminal practices throughout Europe for centuries, while their systematic approach to assassination became a model for other criminal organizations. The fear they generated through their reputation as master poisoners became an integral part of their political power, demonstrating how psychological warfare could be as effective as physical violence. The scientific knowledge accumulated through their criminal activities also contributed, albeit indirectly, to legitimate advances in medicine and pharmacology. The detailed observations recorded by Borgia poison masters provided insights into human physiology and the effects of various substances that would later be used by legitimate researchers to develop treatments and cures. In the end, the Borgias' mastery of poison represented both the pinnacle of Renaissance criminal sophistication and a profound corruption of the healing arts. They transformed substances that could have been used to cure illness into instruments of death, perverting medical knowledge for criminal purposes and creating a legacy of fear that would outlive their political power by centuries. The marriage politics of the Borgia family represented one of the most cynical and deadly applications of Renaissance diplomacy, transforming the sacred institution of matrimony into a weapon of political warfare. Under Pope Alexander VI's direction, his children's marriages became instruments of expansion, sources of wealth, and opportunities for elimination of rivals through a systematic program that treated human lives as expendable resources in the pursuit of power. The papal approach to marriage alliances was revolutionary in its scope and ruthlessness. Rather than simply arranging advantageous unions for his children, Alexander VI treated each marriage as part of a comprehensive strategy for Borgia's expansion throughout Italy and Europe. Marriages were planned years in advance, with potential spouses selected based on detailed analyses of their family's military capabilities, financial resources, and political vulnerabilities. The first major marriage alliance undertaken by Pope Alexander VI was the union of his eldest son, Juan, with Maria Enriquez de Luna, daughter of the Count of Alba de Lista. This marriage, arranged in 1493, was designed to strengthen Borgia connections with the Spanish nobility and provide Juan with a territorial base from which to launch future military campaigns. The wedding was celebrated with unprecedented magnificence in Rome, serving as a demonstration of papal wealth and power to the assembled European dignitaries. However, the true nature of Borgia marriage politics became apparent with the multiple marriages of Lucretia Borgia, each of which was carefully timed to advance specific political objectives while eliminating obstacles to family ambitions. Her first marriage to Giovanni Sforza in 1493 was intended to secure Milanese support for papal policies, but when political circumstances changed, the marriage became inconvenient and had to be dissolved through the humiliating annulment proceedings described earlier. The systematic nature of Borgia marriage politics is perhaps best illustrated by the detailed planning that preceded each union. The papal secretariat maintained extensive files on potential marriage partners throughout Europe, including information about their personal characteristics, family connections, financial situations, and political reliability. These files were regularly updated through intelligence reports from Borgia agents operating in major European courts. When a potential marriage target was identified, the Borgias would initiate a comprehensive investigation designed to uncover any information that might be useful in negotiations or future manipulation. This investigation often included attempts to compromise the target or their families through various means, creating leverage that could be used to secure favorable terms or ensure continued cooperation after the marriage was completed. The negotiations surrounding Lucrezia's second marriage to Alfonso of Aragon demonstrated the sophisticated methods employed by the Borgias in securing advantageous unions while maintaining flexibility for future political changes. The marriage contract included unusual provisions that would allow for rapid dissolution if political circumstances required it, while also securing significant financial benefits for the Borgia family regardless of the marriage's duration. Alfonso of Aragon was an ideal target for Borgia marriage politics because his illegitimate birth made him dependent on papal recognition for his status and inheritance, while his connection to the Neapolitan royal family provided valuable political advantages. The marriage initially served Borgia interests well, strengthening their position in southern Italy while generating significant income through Alfonso's estates. However, the marriage also illustrates the deadly nature of Borgia alliance politics. When Alfonso's continued existence became inconvenient for family interests, he was murdered with the same casual efficiency that characterized other Borgia political operations. His death was timed to coincide with negotiations for Lucrezia's third marriage, ensuring minimal disruption to the family's diplomatic strategies. The arrangements for Lucrezia's final marriage to Alfonso d'Este required the most sophisticated diplomatic maneuvering of any Borgia alliance, partly because of the Este family's awareness of what had happened to her previous husbands, and partly because of their genuine reluctance to associate with the notorious papal family. The negotiations extended over several years and involved threats, bribes, and political pressures that demonstrated the full range of Borgia diplomatic capabilities. The Este family's initial rejection of the proposed marriage was overcome through a combination of military threats against their territories and promises of significant financial and political benefits. Pope Alexander VI also arranged for the elimination of several Este rivals, removing obstacles to the marriage while demonstrating the advantages of Borgia alliance. The final marriage contract was more detailed than a typical diplomatic treaty, specifying not only the terms of the union, but also the conditions under which it might be dissolved. The wedding celebrations for Lucrezia's marriage to Alfonso d'Este in 1502 were among the most elaborate of the Renaissance, serving multiple political purposes beyond the simple celebration of matrimony. The guest list was carefully constructed to include representatives from every major Italian power, providing opportunities for discreet diplomatic negotiations and intelligence gathering. The gifts exchanged during the ceremony were selected to convey specific political messages about Borgia power and wealth. During the wedding festivities, several mysterious deaths occurred among the guests, including two minor nobles who had been involved in anti-Borgia conspiracies. These deaths served as powerful reminders to other attendees about the consequences of opposing papal interests, while their timing during the celebration created an atmosphere of fear that enhanced the family's reputation for ruthlessness. The male members of the Borgia family were also subject to strategic marriage arrangements, though their matrimonial politics were complicated by clerical restrictions and military ambitions. Cesare's resignation from the cardinalate in 1498 was partly motivated by his father's desire to arrange an advantageous marriage that would provide military and political benefits to the family. Cesare's marriage to Charlotte d'Albret, sister of the King of Navarre, was negotiated as part of a comprehensive alliance with France that provided military support for Borgia expansion in central Italy. The marriage contract included provisions for French military assistance, financial subsidies, and political recognition of Borgia territorial claims. In return, Cesare provided military services to French interests in Italy and served as an agent for French policy objectives. The youngest Borgia son, Joffre, was married to Sansia of Aragon, illegitimate daughter of Alfonso II of Naples, in an arrangement designed to strengthen papal ties with the Neapolitan court. However, this marriage proved problematic when Sansia began affairs with both Juan and Cesare Borgia, creating family tensions that may have contributed to Juan's eventual murder. The systematic use of marriage as a political weapon extended beyond immediate family members to include numerous relatives and associates who were married to advance Borgia interests throughout Italy. These secondary marriages created a network of family connections that provided intelligence, political influence, and military support for papal objectives. The dissolution of inconvenient marriages was handled with the same ruthless efficiency that characterized other Borgia political operations. Annulments were arranged through manipulation of church law, often involving fabricated evidence or coerced testimony. When legal dissolution was not possible or practical, more direct methods were employed, including the strategic elimination of unwanted spouses. The psychological impact of Borgia marriage politics on contemporary European nobility was profound and lasting. The knowledge that marriage to a Borgia family member might be a death sentence created widespread reluctance to enter into such alliances, while simultaneously demonstrating the family's power and ruthlessness. This reputation became a significant factor in diplomatic negotiations throughout Renaissance Italy. The intelligence networks established through marriage alliances provided the Borgias with unprecedented access to information about their allies and enemies. Lucrezia's positions as Duchess of various territories gave her access to diplomatic correspondence and political planning that she regularly shared with her father and brothers. This information proved invaluable in planning military campaigns and political manipulations. The financial benefits derived from strategic marriages were enormous, providing the Borgias with access to estates, treasuries, and commercial opportunities throughout Italy and Europe. The systematic exploitation of these resources helped fund their military campaigns and criminal operations, while providing the luxury and magnificence that enhanced their political reputation. The ultimate failure of Borgia marriage politics came with the death of Pope Alexander VI in 1503, which exposed the fundamental weakness of alliances based primarily on fear and self-interest rather than genuine mutual benefit. Without papal authority to enforce compliance, many of the family's marriage-based alliances quickly dissolved, leaving their surviving members isolated and vulnerable. The legacy of Borgia marriage politics influenced European diplomatic practices for centuries, establishing precedents for the systematic use of matrimonial alliances as instruments of political warfare. Their innovations in marriage diplomacy became standard practice among major European powers, though few subsequent practitioners matched their combination of sophistication and ruthlessness. The human cost of Borgia marriage politics was enormous, with dozens of individuals dying to serve the family's matrimonial strategies. The systematic treatment of human lives as expendable resources in pursuit of political advantage represents one of the most chilling aspects of their criminal enterprise, demonstrating how institutional power could be used to transform personal relationships into weapons of mass destruction. The death of Pope Alexander VI on August 18, 1503, marked the beginning of the end for the Borgia criminal empire. The man who had transformed the papacy into a sophisticated criminal organization died under circumstances that remain mysterious to this day. But his passing immediately exposed the fundamental weakness of a power structure that depended entirely on papal authority and the fear it could inspire. The events leading up to Alexander VI's death had been ominous for the Borgia family's continued dominance. Throughout the summer of 1503, several key allies had been eliminated through what appeared to be a series of coordinated assassinations. While military campaigns in the Romagna had stalled due to unexpected resistance from local populations, the Pope himself had seemed increasingly paranoid and suspicious, even of his closest associates, suggesting that he sensed the growing threats to his position. On the evening of August 5, 1503, Pope Alexander VI and his son Cesare attended a dinner party at the villa of Cardinal Adriano Castellesi, a wealthy church official who had recently fallen out of papal favor. Both men became violently ill during the course of the evening, exhibiting symptoms that many contemporary observers immediately recognized as consistent with arsenic poisoning. The official explanation for their illness was malaria, a common disease in the humid Roman summer, but few people accepted this diagnosis. The symptoms were too acute and too specifically timed to be explained by natural causes. More significantly, Cardinal Castellesi, who had consumed the same food and wine as his guests, remained perfectly healthy throughout the evening and in the days that followed. Contemporary accounts suggest that the Borgias had planned to poison Cardinal Castellesi during the dinner, using their standard method of introducing cantarella into his wine. However, according to several sources, the poisoned wine was served to the wrong guests through either an accident by a confused servant or a deliberate act of sabotage by someone who knew of the assassination plot. Cesare Borgia recovered from his illness after several weeks of intensive medical treatment, though he was left weakened and unable to actively manage his military and political affairs during the crucial period following his father's death. Pope Alexander VI was less fortunate, succumbing to the poison on August 18th after nearly 2 weeks of agony, that contemporary witnesses described as horrific even by the standards of Renaissance medicine. The immediate aftermath of the Pope's death revealed the extent to which Borgia power had depended on fear and papal authority rather than genuine loyalty or mutual interest. Within hours of Alexander VI's death becoming known, former allies began distancing themselves from the family, while enemies who had been cowered into submission suddenly found the courage to seek revenge for years of intimidation and abuse. The College of Cardinals, which had been carefully managed through bribery and intimidation during Alexander VI's papacy, immediately began maneuvering to prevent any Borgia influence over the selection of his successor. Cardinals who had profited from papal corruption suddenly discovered their reformist principles, while those who had been threatened or intimidated seized the opportunity to seek justice for past wrongs. The papal treasury, which had been systematically looted to fund Borgia criminal activities, was found to be nearly empty, despite the enormous sums that had flowed through it during Alexander VI's reign. The new papal administration discovered that funds intended for church operations had been diverted to military campaigns, assassination operations, and personal luxuries for Borgia family members. More damaging still was the discovery of extensive documentation of Borgia criminal activities within the Vatican archives. The meticulous record-keeping that had been a strength of their operations became a fatal weakness when hostile investigators gained access to detailed accounts of murders, extortion schemes, and political manipulations. These documents provided evidence that would be used to justify actions against surviving family members for years to come. Cesare Borgia's attempts to maintain his power in the face of these developments demonstrated both his political sophistication and the ultimate limitations of criminal leadership. Despite his weakened condition and the collapse of his father's protective authority, he managed to negotiate temporary agreements with several rivals and maintain control of some territories through sheer force of personality and reputation. However, Cesare's position was fundamentally unsustainable without papal support. His military forces, which had been paid through papal funds, began deserting when their salaries stopped coming. His political alliances, which had been based on fear of papal retaliation, dissolved as it became clear that the Vatican's new leadership was hostile to Borgia interests. The election of Pius III as Alexander VI's successor represented a complete repudiation of Borgia policies and methods. The new pope, who had been a consistent opponent of Alexander VI's corruption, immediately initiated investigations into papal finances and began processes to recover church property that had been illegally transferred to Borgia family members. Pius III's papacy lasted only 26 days, but his brief reign was sufficient to establish the precedent that the new papal administration would not tolerate continued Borgia influence. His successor, Julius II, was even more hostile to the family, having been a personal enemy of Alexander VI and a target of Borgia assassination attempts. Pope Julius II's election in October 1503 sealed the fate of the remaining Borgia power structure. The new pope had a personal understanding of Borgia methods, having survived at least 2 assassination attempts during Alexander VI's reign, and was determined to eliminate any possibility of their return to influence. He immediately began systematic persecution of Borgia allies and agents throughout the Papal States. Cesare's response to these developments revealed both his desperation and his continued capacity for violence. Unable to maintain his position through traditional political means, he increasingly resorted to the terrorist tactics that had served him well during his rise to power. However, these methods, which had been effective when backed by papal authority, now served only to further isolate him from potential allies. The military campaigns launched by Julius II against Borgia strongholds were characterized by unusual brutality, reflecting the new pope's determination to completely eliminate Borgia influence from central Italy. Cities that had served as bases for Cesare's operations were systematically reduced, while civilians suspected of supporting Borgia interests were subjected to harsh treatment designed to discourage future cooperation. Lucrezia Borgia's survival of her family's downfall was largely due to her marriage to Alfonso d'Este and her physical distance from the immediate conflicts in central Italy. However, she faced constant suspicion and hostility from her husband's family and subjects, who viewed her as a potential source of contamination and danger. Her later years were marked by continuous efforts to rehabilitate her reputation and establish her legitimacy as Duchess of Ferrara. The fate of minor Borgia family members and associates varied widely depending on their level of involvement in criminal activities and their ability to adapt to changed circumstances. Some managed to quietly disappear into obscurity, while others were hunted down and eliminated by enemies seeking revenge for past wrongs. The Borgia network of agents and accomplices throughout Italy was systematically dismantled through a combination of legal proceedings and extrajudicial violence. The international dimensions of the Borgia collapse were equally dramatic, as European powers that had maintained diplomatic relations with Alexander VI's regime rushed to distance themselves from the disgraced family. Treaties and agreements negotiated during the Borgia papacy were repudiated, while foreign agents who had worked with the family found themselves abandoned and vulnerable to retaliation. The cultural impact of the Borgia downfall was immediate and lasting, providing material for artists, writers, and political theorists who sought to understand the implications of their rise and fall. The family's spectacular collapse became a cautionary tale about the ultimate futility of power based solely on fear and corruption, while their criminal innovations influenced criminal practices throughout Europe for generations. The investigation of Borgia crimes that began after Alexander VI's death revealed the full scope of their criminal enterprise for the first time. Conservative estimates suggested that they had been responsible for over 200 assassinations, while their financial crimes had diverted millions of ducats from legitimate church purposes to fund their personal ambitions. Perhaps most significantly, the Borgia downfall contributed to a broader crisis of confidence in papal authority that would have far-reaching consequences for European Christianity. The revelation that the Church's highest office had been systematically corrupted for criminal purposes provided ammunition for reformers who argued that the entire ecclesiastical structure needed fundamental change. The ultimate irony of the Borgia story is that their very success in corrupting the papacy contributed to their own destruction. By demonstrating that papal authority could be used for criminal purposes, they undermined the respect and fear that had made their power possible in the first place. Their legacy became a testament to the self-defeating nature of institutional corruption and the ultimate triumph of justice over criminal power. The downfall of the Borgia dynasty marked the end of an era in Renaissance politics, bringing to a close a period when criminal methods had been successfully integrated into the highest levels of European governance. Their collapse served as a powerful reminder that even the most sophisticated criminal organizations ultimately depend on the tolerance or ignorance of the societies they parasitize, and that exposure and resistance can bring down even the most powerful criminal empires. Story 2, The Whitechapel Forger, London, October 1888 Detective Inspector Frederick Aberlin pulled his coat tighter against the October chill as he navigated the narrow cobblestone streets of Whitechapel. The gas lamps flickered weakly in the fog, casting eerie shadows that seemed to dance with malevolent intent. It had been a month since the last Jack the Ripper murder, and while the press continued their sensational coverage, Aberlin found himself drawn to a different case entirely, one that the newspapers had largely ignored. The body of Thomas Hartwell, a respected antiquarian bookseller, had been discovered 3 days prior in his shop on Dorset Street. Unlike the Ripper's victims, Hartwell had been killed with precision, a single thrust to the heart with what the coroner believed to be a letter opener. The scene was peculiar, books scattered across the floor, drawers pulled open, but the till remained untouched, still containing nearly £2 in coins and notes. Aberlin paused outside Hartwell's shop, now sealed with police tape. The constable on duty, a young man named Patterson, snapped to attention. "Any developments, Patterson?" Aberlin inquired, his breath visible in the cold air. "Nothing suspicious, sir, though that gentleman from yesterday returned again this morning, asking about Mr. Hartwell's manuscripts." "Which gentleman?" "Professor Aldrich Blackwood, sir, from the British Museum. Said he had business with the deceased regarding some rare documents." Aberlin nodded thoughtfully. This was the third mention of Professor Blackwood in connection with the case. Yesterday, Mrs. Hartwell had mentioned that her late husband had been expecting the professor for an important meeting on the very day he was murdered. "Right then. I believe it's time I paid Professor Blackwood a visit." The British Museum stood like a fortress of knowledge against the gray London sky. Aberlin made his way through the grand entrance hall, his footsteps echoing on the marble floors. A clerk directed him to the Department of Medieval Manuscripts, located in the museum's East Wing. Professor Aldrich Blackwood was a man in his 50s, with steel-gray hair and wire-rimmed spectacles that gave him a scholarly air. His office was cramped but meticulously organized, with manuscripts and documents arranged in careful stacks across every available surface. Detective Inspector Aberline, I presume? Blackwood rose from behind his desk, extending a manicured hand. I've been expecting you. Terrible business about poor Thomas. Indeed it is, Professor. I understand you had an appointment with Mr. Hartwell on the day he was murdered? Blackwood's expression grew somber. Yes, we were to discuss a most extraordinary discovery. Thomas had contacted me about a manuscript he believed to be of significant historical importance. A previously unknown work by Geoffrey Chaucer, or so he claimed. Aberlin raised an eyebrow. Even his limited education had taught him that Chaucer was England's greatest medieval poet. Such a discovery would be worth a considerable sum. This manuscript, did you examine it? Regrettably, no. When I arrived at the appointed time, I found the shop in chaos and the police already present. Poor Thomas was beyond help, and the manuscript was nowhere to be found. Can you describe this document in more detail? Professor Blackwood removed his spectacles and cleaned them methodically. According to Thomas, it was a collection of previously unknown Canterbury tales, written in Chaucer's hand on vellum, consistent with the late 14th century. If authentic, it would be worth thousands of pounds and would revolutionize our understanding of medieval literature. A considerable motive for murder, wouldn't you say? I suppose it could be, though I can hardly imagine anyone killing for a manuscript, authentic or otherwise. Aberlin studied the professor's face carefully. The man seemed genuinely distressed about Hartwell's death, but there was something else, a nervous energy that suggested he wasn't revealing everything he knew. Professor, in your expert opinion, how difficult would it be to forge such a manuscript convincingly? Blackwood replaced his spectacles and considered the question. Extraordinarily difficult, Inspector. One would need access to period-appropriate vellum, inks that would pass chemical analysis, and most challenging of all, the ability to replicate Chaucer's distinctive handwriting and linguistic patterns. The number of people capable of such a feat could likely be counted on one hand. And who might these people be? Well, myself, certainly. Dr. Margaret Thornfield at Oxford. She's done extensive work on medieval paleography, perhaps Vincent Carmichael, though he's more of a Renaissance specialist. Blackwood paused. And there's Edmund Fairfax, though I hesitate to mention his name. Why the hesitation? Fairfax was dismissed from Cambridge several years ago amid allegations of academic fraud. Nothing was ever proven, mind you, but there were whispers about questionable manuscripts appearing in private collections. He's fallen on rather hard times since then. Aberlin made a note of the name. Where might I find Mr. Fairfax? Last I heard, he was living in rented rooms in Bloomsbury, attempting to make a living as a freelance manuscript consultant. Rather a come-down for a man who once held the Hetherington Chair in medieval studies. After leaving the British Museum, Aberlin made his way to Bloomsbury. The address Professor Blackwood had provided led him to a narrow townhouse that had clearly seen better days. The landlady, a sharp-eyed woman named Mrs. Pemberton, directed him to the third floor. Edmund Fairfax's rooms were a stark contrast to Professor Blackwood's organized office. Books and papers were strewn about in apparent chaos, and the air was thick with the smell of pipe tobacco and unwashed clothes. Fairfax himself was a thin, nervous man in his 40s, with ink-stained fingers and the pale complexion of someone who spent too much time indoors. Inspector Aberline, this is unexpected. I trust this isn't about that business with the Venetian Codex. I've told Mr. Rothschild repeatedly that the authentication was performed to the best of my abilities. Actually, Mr. Fairfax, I'm here about the murder of Thomas Hartwell. Fairfax's face went pale. Thomas is dead? Good God, when? How? 3 days ago. Stabbed through the heart in his shop. I'm told you knew him well. We had some business dealings. Nothing recent, mind you. I haven't spoken to Thomas in months. Aberlin noticed the man's hands were shaking slightly. What sort of business dealings? Thomas occasionally consulted me about manuscripts. Authentication work, mostly. He dealt in rare books and sometimes needed an expert opinion. Were you aware he claimed to have discovered a previously unknown Chaucer manuscript? Fairfax's reaction was immediate and telling. His face flushed, and he began fidgeting with a pen on his desk. Chaucer? No, that is, Thomas never mentioned any Chaucer to me. Interesting. Professor Blackwood seemed to think you were one of the few people capable of creating such a forgery. Blackwood said that? Fairfax's voice rose in pitch. That pompous ass has been trying to ruin my reputation for years. Ever since the Cambridge business, he's poisoned the entire academic community against me. What exactly happened at Cambridge, Mr. Fairfax? Fairfax slumped in his chair, suddenly looking older than his years. There were allegations that I had passed off a forged manuscript as authentic. A supposed letter from Thomas Becket that I claimed to have discovered in the college library. The authentication process was less rigorous than it should have been. Was it a forgery? That was never definitively established. The manuscript was sold to a private collector before a thorough examination could be completed. Rather convenient for my accusers, wouldn't you say? Aberline studied the man's face. Fairfax was clearly bitter about his fall from grace, but was he bitter enough to kill? And where did Thomas Hartwell fit into this web of academic rivalry and questionable manuscripts? Mr. Fairfax, where were you on Tuesday afternoon between 2 and 4 o'clock? Tuesday? I was here working on a consultation for a dealer in Bath, 15th century illuminated manuscripts. Mrs. Pemberton can confirm I didn't leave my rooms all day. After confirming Fairfax's alibi with the landlady, Aberline decided to pay a visit to Mrs. Hartwell. The widow lived in a modest house in Mile End, a considerable step up from the squalor of Whitechapel proper. She was a woman in her 50s with graying hair and the red-rimmed eyes of recent grief. Inspector Aberline, please come in. Have you made any progress in finding Thomas's killer? We're pursuing several leads, Mrs. Hartwell. I was hoping you might be able to tell me more about your husband's recent business activities, particularly regarding a Chaucer manuscript. Mrs. Hartwell's expression grew troubled. That manuscript was the cause of considerable excitement in our household. Thomas was convinced it was authentic and worth a great deal of money. He'd been corresponding with scholars and collectors for weeks. Do you know where he acquired it? A young woman brought it to the shop about a month ago. She claimed it had been in her family for generations, but she needed money urgently. Thomas paid her £50 for it, more than we could really afford, but he was certain it was worth far more. Can you describe this young woman? Well-dressed, educated by her speech. Pretty, with dark hair and green eyes. She gave her name as Miss Catherine Morrison, but Thomas suspected that wasn't her real name. Why did he suspect that? She seemed nervous, kept looking over her shoulder as if she was afraid of being followed. And when Thomas asked about the manuscript's provenance, her story kept changing slightly. First she said it belonged to her grandfather, then her great-uncle. Aberline made careful notes. A mysterious seller with a false identity suggested the manuscript might be stolen property, which would complicate matters considerably. Mrs. Hartwell, did your husband keep any records of his correspondence about the manuscript? Oh, yes. Thomas was meticulous about such things. His business papers are still in the shop, though I haven't had the heart to go through them since it happened. With Mrs. Hartwell's permission, Aberline returned to the sealed shop and began examining Thomas Hartwell's business records. The correspondence regarding the Chaucer manuscript painted a picture of growing excitement in academic and collecting circles. Professor Blackwood's letters were particularly enthusiastic, describing the potential discovery as the find of the century. But there were other letters as well. A dealer named Reginald Ashworth had offered to purchase the manuscript sight unseen for £500. Dr. Margaret Thornfield from Oxford had requested permission to examine it for her research. And perhaps most interesting of all, there was a letter from someone calling himself a concerned scholar, warning Hartwell that the manuscript was too good to be true, and advising him to be very careful about who you trust. The handwriting of this anonymous letter was distinctive, precise and scholarly, with unusual flourishes on certain letters. Aberline carefully folded the letter and placed it in his coat pocket. The next morning brought an unexpected development. Constable Patterson appeared at Aberline's office with news that a manuscript matching the description of the missing Chaucer had been offered for sale at Sotheby's auction house. The manuscript was brought in yesterday by a well-dressed gentleman, Patterson reported. He gave his name as Mr. Charles Whitmore and claimed to be acting on behalf of a private collector who wished to remain anonymous. Aberlin and Patterson made their way to Sotheby's, where they were met by Mr. Henry Pembroke, the auction house's manuscript expert. Pembroke was a distinguished gentleman in his 60s, with the bearing of someone accustomed to handling priceless artifacts. Inspector, I must say this is highly irregular. We have strict policies about the provenance of items we accept for auction. I'm sure you do, Mr. Pembroke. However, this manuscript may be connected to a murder investigation. I'd like to examine it, if you please. Pembroke led them to a secure viewing room where the manuscript lay open in a specially designed case. Even to Aberlin's untrained eye, it was clearly an impressive document. The vellum pages were covered in careful medieval script, with elaborate illuminated capitals beginning each tale. The gentleman who brought this in claimed it was a recently discovered Chaucer manuscript, Pembroke explained. If authentic, it would be worth a considerable sum. However, I had some concerns about the provenance documentation. What sort of concerns? The ownership history seemed rather vague. Mr. Whitmore claimed it had been in a private family collection for centuries, but he couldn't provide the detailed documentation we typically require for such significant pieces. Did you have the manuscript authenticated? I sent it to Dr. Margaret Thornfield at Oxford for preliminary examination. Her report should arrive this afternoon. Aberlin studied the manuscript more closely. The writing was indeed elaborate and appeared to be in Middle English, though he couldn't read the actual text. However, something about the illuminated capitals struck him as unusual. They seemed almost too perfect, too fresh for a document supposedly 600 years old. Mr. Pembroke, in your expert opinion, does this manuscript appear authentic? Pembroke hesitated. It's certainly skillfully executed. The vellum appears to be period appropriate, and the inks have the right visual characteristics. However, there's something about it that makes me uneasy. The condition is perhaps too good for a manuscript of this age. Can you describe Mr. Whitmore? Certainly. A gentleman in his 40s, well-dressed in a dark suit. Medium height, brown hair with gray at the temples. He spoke with an educated accent and seemed quite knowledgeable about medieval manuscripts. The description could fit any number of people, but Aberlin made careful note of the details. He was beginning to see the outline of a complex scheme involving forgery, theft, and ultimately murder. That afternoon, Dr. Margaret Thornfield's report arrived at Sotheby's. Aberlin read it with growing interest. While Dr. Thornfield acknowledged the manuscript's superficial authenticity, she raised several concerning points. The dialect used in the text, while accurate to Chaucer's period, contains several anachronistic expressions that wouldn't have been used until decades after the poet's death. More damning still, microscopic examination revealed that the ink contained traces of synthetic compounds not available until the 19th century. It's an extraordinarily skillful forgery, Dr. Thornfield had written, but a forgery nonetheless. The creator has extensive knowledge of medieval literature and paleography, but has made subtle errors that reveal the deception. Armed with this information, Aberlin decided it was time to set a trap. He asked Mr. Pembroke to contact Mr. Whitmore and arrange for the return of the manuscript, claiming that Sotheby's needed additional documentation before proceeding with the auction. The meeting was arranged for the following afternoon. Aberlin positioned himself and several constables in concealment around Sotheby's, waiting to see who would appear to claim the forged manuscript. At precisely 3 o'clock, a familiar figure approached the auction house entrance. Professor Aldrich Blackwood, looking nervous and frequently checking his surroundings, entered the building carrying a leather portfolio. Aberlin waited several minutes before following. Inside, he found Blackwood in heated discussion with Mr. Pembroke. "I'm afraid there's been a misunderstanding," Blackwood was saying. "Mr. Whitmore has been called away on urgent business and asked me to retrieve the manuscript on his behalf." "Professor Blackwood," Aberlin announced his presence, stepping into the room. "How convenient to find you here." Blackwood spun around, his face draining of color. "Inspector, I was simply helping a colleague by collecting a forged manuscript that was stolen from the scene of a murder." "Forged? I don't understand. The manuscript was presented to me as authentic." Dr. Thornfield's analysis suggests otherwise. The manuscript contains anachronistic language and modern ink compounds. Quite skillfully done, but not skillful enough to fool an expert examination. Blackwood's shoulders sagged in defeat. I never intended for anyone to be hurt. Thomas wasn't supposed to be there that afternoon. Why don't you tell me what really happened, Professor? With evident reluctance, Blackwood began his confession. The scheme had begun several months earlier when he encountered Edmund Fairfax at a rare book auction. Despite their academic rivalry, both men were facing financial difficulties. Blackwood due to gambling debts, Fairfax due to his ruined reputation. Edmund approached me with a proposition, Blackwood explained. He had perfected a technique for creating convincing medieval manuscripts. The plan was to create a Chaucer forgery and sell it through Thomas Hartwell's shop. Thomas had a reputation for discretion and wouldn't ask too many questions about provenance. But something went wrong. Edmund's work was too good. When I examined the forged manuscript, even I was initially convinced of its authenticity. We decided to aim higher, rather than selling it quietly for a few £100s. We would present it as a major discovery and auction it publicly for thousands. And Thomas Hartwell? Thomas was supposed to be the innocent middleman. We arranged for a young actress, a friend of Edmund's, to sell him the manuscript, claiming it was a family heirloom. Thomas would then contact scholars and collectors, building excitement for the discovery. We planned to steal it back before the deception was revealed, making it appear that Thomas had been the victim of a simple theft. But Mr. Hartwell became suspicious? Blackwood nodded miserably. Thomas was more knowledgeable than we gave him credit for. He began asking probing questions about the manuscript's provenance and even suggested bringing in additional experts for authentication. We realized he was close to exposing the forgery. So you decided to kill him? No, that was never the plan. I went to the shop that afternoon intending to convince Thomas to sell the manuscript quickly before any detailed examination could take place. I found him at his desk, examining the manuscript with a magnifying glass. When I entered, he looked up with this expression of disappointment and betrayal. Blackwood's voice broke slightly. He knew. He'd figured out that I was involved in the forgery. He said he was going to contact the authorities and expose the entire scheme. I panicked. I saw the letter opener on his desk, and it happened so quickly. One moment we were arguing, and the next, you stabbed him. I never meant to kill him. It was a moment of blind panic. Afterward, I searched for the manuscript, but I couldn't find it. Thomas must have hidden it when he realized what was happening. Aberlin had been taking careful notes throughout the confession. Where is the manuscript now? Edmund has it. After Thomas died, I went to Edmund's rooms in a state of near hysteria. He was furious about what had happened, but he agreed to help dispose of the evidence. We decided to try to sell the manuscript through Sotheby's, using a false identity to distance ourselves from the crime. And the anonymous warning letter sent to Mr. Hartwell? Blackwood looked surprised. What warning letter? Aberlin produced the letter from his coat pocket. This was among Mr. Hartwell's papers. Someone calling himself a concerned scholar warned him about the manuscript being too good to be true. Blackwood examined the letter and shook his head. This isn't my handwriting. Edmund must have sent this. Perhaps he was having second thoughts about the scheme. The arrest of Edmund Fairfax followed quickly. Faced with Blackwood's confession and the evidence against him, Fairfax admitted his role in creating the forged manuscript, but maintained he had no knowledge of Blackwood's intention to murder Thomas Hartwell. I warned Thomas in that letter, Fairfax insisted during his interrogation. When I realized how thoroughly Blackwood had convinced him of the manuscript's authenticity, I began to feel guilty about deceiving such an honest man. I hoped the warning would make him more cautious. Yet you continued with the forgery? Aldrich convinced me it was harmless. We would create the manuscript, generate some excitement, then arrange for its disappearance before anyone could expose it as a fake. No one would be seriously harmed, and we would both escape our financial difficulties. What about the young woman who sold the manuscript to Mr. Hartwell? Sarah Bennett. She's an actress from the Lyceum Theater. Aldrich hired her to play the role of the mysterious seller. She had no idea the manuscript was forged or that anyone would be hurt. The case concluded with Professor Blackwood being charged with murder and Edmund Fairfax being charged as an accessory to fraud. The forged Chaucer manuscript was placed in police evidence, where it would remain as a testament to the deadly consequences of academic ambition and financial desperation. Sarah Bennett, the actress who had unwittingly initiated the chain of events, was questioned and released without charges. Her testimony confirmed the details of Blackwood and Fairfax's scheme, and she expressed genuine shock at learning that her innocent performance had contributed to a man's death. As Aberlin walked through the fog-shrouded streets of Whitechapel on the evening after the arrests, he reflected on the case. In a neighborhood where violence was commonplace and life was often brutal and short, the murder of Thomas Hartwell stood out for its peculiar motives. Here was a crime born not of desperation or passion, but of intellectual pride and the desire for academic recognition. The irony was not lost on him that Professor Blackwood, a respected scholar with access to genuine medieval manuscripts worth far more than any forgery, had risked everything for a deception that was ultimately doomed to fail. The very expertise that made him capable of recognizing a skilled forgery also made it inevitable that other experts would eventually expose the fraud. Thomas Hartwell, meanwhile, had died because of his integrity. His insistence on authentication and his growing suspicions about the manuscript's provenance had made him a threat to the conspirators' scheme. In a world where many dealers might have been content to sell first and ask questions later, Hartwell's commitment to honest dealing had cost him his life. The case also highlighted the growing sophistication of art and manuscript forgery in the late Victorian era. Advances in chemistry and printing technology were making it increasingly possible to create convincing fakes, while the expanding market for medieval artifacts provided both motive and opportunity for fraud. The Hartwell murder would not be the last crime connected to forged antiquities, as Aberlin would discover in future cases. 1 week after the arrests, Aberlin received an unexpected visitor at Scotland Yard. Mrs. Hartwell, dressed in mourning black, had come to thank him for solving her husband's murder. "Inspector, I wanted you to know how grateful I am for your diligence in this matter. Thomas always said that justice was the most important thing, more important than money or reputation. Your husband was an honorable man, Mrs. Hartwell. I'm sorry that his honesty cost him his life." "Perhaps, but I like to think he would be satisfied knowing that the truth came out in the end. That's what he cared about most, the truth." As she prepared to leave, Mrs. Hartwell turned back with one final comment. "Inspector, there's something I thought you should know. Yesterday, I received a letter from a collector in Edinburgh who had heard about Thomas's death. He wrote to tell me that Thomas had contacted him several weeks ago, asking for advice about a manuscript he suspected might be forged. Thomas was planning to expose the fraud even before Professor Blackwood killed him." This revelation added another layer of tragedy to the case. Thomas Hartwell had not only discovered the deception, but had been actively working to expose it, making his murder even more senseless and cruel. In the months that followed, Professor Blackwood was convicted of murder and sentenced to death, though the sentence was later commuted to life imprisonment due to the unpremeditated nature of the crime. Edmund Fairfax received 7 years in prison for fraud and conspiracy. Both men's academic careers were destroyed, their reputations ruined beyond any possibility of redemption. The forged Chaucer manuscript became something of a curiosity in police circles, a reminder of how even the most sophisticated criminals could be undone by their own hubris. Dr. Margaret Thornfield, whose expert analysis had exposed the forgery, later wrote a scholarly paper about the case, using it as an example of the importance of rigorous authentication procedures in the antiquities trade. For Detective Inspector Aberlin, the Hartwell case represented a departure from the violent street crimes that typically occupied his attention in Whitechapel. It was a puzzle that required intellectual rather than physical investigation, a chess match of deduction and evidence rather than a direct confrontation with criminal violence. Yet in some ways, it was more disturbing than the brutal murders that had made Whitechapel notorious. The Ripper's crimes, horrific as they were, arose from obvious madness and required no complex motive. The murder of Thomas Hartwell, by contrast, was the product of educated minds that had chosen to pursue a course of deception and ultimately violence in service of nothing more noble than financial gain and academic prestige. As autumn gave way to winter in 1888, Aberlin would return his attention to the more sensational crimes that dominated the headlines, but he would never forget the quiet antiquarian bookseller whose commitment to truth had made him a target for those who preferred deception, and whose death had revealed the dark side of Victorian society's obsession with historical artifacts and academic achievement. The case of the Whitechapel forger, as it came to be known in police files, would serve as a precedent for future investigations involving art fraud and academic crime. It demonstrated that even in an age of increasing scientific sophistication, the oldest motives, greed, pride, and fear, continued to drive people to desperate acts. Thomas Hartwell was buried in Kensal Green Cemetery on a gray November morning, attended by his widow, a handful of friends from the antiquarian book trade, and Detective Inspector Aberlin. The modest headstone bore a simple inscription: Thomas Hartwell, 1845 to 1888. He sought truth in all things. It was, Aberlin reflected, a fitting epitaph for a man whose devotion to authenticity had ultimately cost him everything, but whose death had ensured that justice at least would not be forged. Let the hush of the night wrap around you. And know this: some stories don't end. They drift, they dream, they wait for you to listen again. Good night.